He is to the American space program what the Wright brothers were to flight. This pioneer of space travel, the first American to orbit the Earth, did so again at 77, the oldest person ever in space. A veteran of 2 wars, he triumphed in the sky both as a combat-tested fighter pilot and as an astronaut. His career as a U.S. Senator spanned more than 2 decades, but Americans will remember him foremost as a man who answered the call of his nation and followed a dream of returning to space one last time. His name is John Herschel Glenn, Jr., and he is a legend of air power.
We have a go for engine start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
As the Space Shuttle Discovery blasted off on the afternoon of October 29, 1998, John Glenn once again made history. The flight was epic on many levels, but one factor stood out over the others. It wasn't the spacecraft. This was Discovery's 25th mission. It wasn't the payload or the experiments either. It was the crew that was so significant. The 7 shuttle astronauts on this mission were part of a multinational team featuring crew members from Japan, Spain, and a 77-year-old former astronaut turned U.S. Senator named John Glenn. But why would NASA send someone that age into space? Because simply, John Glenn was no ordinary senior citizen. He is John Herschel Glenn, Jr., born July 18, 1921 in Cambridge, Ohio, the oldest child of John Sr., a railroad worker and owner of a plumbing supply company, and Clara, an elementary school teacher. His parents relocated to New Concord, Ohio when John was a young boy, and he grew up in the small community. Raised by strict but loving parents of a strong Christian faith, they taught him the virtues of character, honesty, and perseverance, and he applied them to everything he did. When John graduated from high school, he and longtime girlfriend Annie Castor enrolled at Muskingum College in New Concord. John wanted to study medicine, and Annie majored in music. They planned to marry after college, but an unforeseen incident changed everything. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941. An unsuspecting nation was devastated when the Japanese waged a surprise attack on the U.S. naval station at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
After the bombing at Pearl Harbor, John felt compelled to serve his country. Annie agreed to put their wedding plans on hold while John dropped out of school to join the Naval Aviation Cadet Program. It was there that he befriended a tall Texan named Tom Miller.
He worked hard at everything to be the very best, and he was one of the so-called cadet officers in the troop group, the students that were there.
John took every opportunity to fly during flight school and in his squadron, even logging hours on his days off. Knowing there would be stiff competition, he set his sights on flying fighters. He was anxious to see combat. In March of 1943, John Glenn graduated from flight school and accepted a commission in the Marine Corps. But before reporting for duty, he returned home to marry Annie. Soon after, Glenn and friend Tom Miller transferred into a fighter squadron at El Centro, California. Their new commander was impressed with the two young officers and felt they would make good fighter pilots.
We were practicing bombing and air-to-air gunnery work, and in that area, John was obviously one of the best in the squadron. He would outshoot or outbomb with some of the more senior pilots in the squadron.
Within months, Glenn and Miller were sent to the war zone, flying combat missions over the Marshall Islands. But they never saw aerial combat. Most of their targets were on the ground.
The main purpose of our being there was to keep those islands from being built up by the Japanese to more or less behind the American lines. So we were put in the role of destroying their guns, their ammunition supplies, and keeping any Japanese force from supporting those facilities there.
Glenn flew 59 combat missions before returning home, where he was assigned to the Patuxent Naval Air Station as a test pilot. In the following years, he served tours of duty in China, Guam, and as an instructor in a flight instructor school. When the United States entered the Korean War, John once again took to the skies and saw aerial action in the combat zone. His motivation to down 5 of the enemy and become an ace earned him the nickname MiG Mad Marine. But the war ended with Glenn too short of his goal. For his bravery and skills in both World War II and Korea, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross 6 times and was awarded the Air Medal with 18 clusters, plus numerous other awards and commendations. In all, he flew 149 combat missions. But Glenn found himself behind a desk in Washington in the years following the Korean War. Although his family had grown to include 2 children, he was determined not to end his career as a bureaucrat. So he convinced the Pentagon to authorize Project Bullet, a promotional supersonic flight across the U.S. Given the green light, Glenn leapt at the opportunity, setting a transcontinental speed record by flying from New York to Los Angeles in 3 hours and 23 minutes. It was July of 1957. John had rocketed into the record books and become a nationally recognized hero overnight. But the euphoria was short-lived. Later that year, an America locked in a nuclear tense Cold War with the Soviet Union was caught off guard when the Russians launched Sputnik, the world's first space satellite.
When the Soviets launched Sputnik in October 4th of 1957, what they did was demonstrate to the world that they had the capability to send a satellite overhead, certainly, but more important than that, the ability to send a nuclear weapon into space and to bring it down wherever they wished, anywhere in the world. And for the United States, for the first time in our history, our 2 great oceans would no longer protect us. We were devastated by this.
It was a tremendous shock to the American people that the Russians suddenly are able to put an object in orbit around space. This caused a considerable concern within the Congress, within the President, with the technical community to, at this point, try to catch up and get back in our position in space as considered the world leader.
The American space program was in its infancy at the time. Known by its acronym NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was tasked with developing a launch vehicle that could send intercontinental ballistic missiles to the Soviet Union from the United States. Now there was another objective, to top the Soviets in space. The only way to beat the Russians was to put a man up there, and NASA scientists worked feverishly toward that goal.
in the 1950s, for the first time, the possibility existed. Now we were developing the vehicles necessary to send humans up, and as soon as that started to happen, people began to advocate for a manned program, a human space flight program of some type, to basically learn whether or not humans can survive in this very harsh atmosphere of space, and to be able to function in any way that would enable them to do something useful.
NASA turned to the armed forces to find qualified candidates for its manned space program. The military was stocked with fighter pilots, men who had endured extensive training, high altitudes, and could handle G-forces. These men were prime contenders as astronauts and were required to meet certain criteria: be less than 40 years old, shorter than 5 feet 11 inches, of excellent physical condition, have at least a bachelor's degree in engineering or a related field, be a qualified jet pilot with test pilot experience, and have logged a minimum of 1,500 flight hours. Additionally, the United States government downplayed the military background of the applicants.
Consequently, here they have 7 military pilots or astronauts, and so in an effort to try to take the emphasis off the military, they refused or required that the astronauts not wear uniforms at all, that they wear civilian clothes all the time.
In April of 1959, NASA introduced the 7 men selected for the Mercury spaceflight program. John Glenn was part of the group, but just barely. Standing at 5 feet 11 inches and at 38 years of age, he was the oldest of the astronauts. But the Mercury 7, as they were called, were closely matched in ability.
The original call, by the way, that NASA had was for 6 astronauts, not 7. But after they had interviewed this last small group, they couldn't make a cut between any of those 7. And so they decided to just take them all.
Their training lasted more than a year before NASA was ready to send one of the Mercury 7 into space. Wanting to be first, John was crushed when fellow astronauts Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom were chosen ahead of him.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I knew he wanted to be early in space, but as I saw it as just an outside observer, that the space shot that was going to count was going to be the orbital. And I said, I don't know why you're so cotton picking upset, because in my opinion, they're saving you for the orbit, which is going to be the most important.
Miller was right. Even if Glenn had made the first Mercury flight, he wouldn't have been the first man in space. The Soviets had once again upstaged the Americans by sending a manned spacecraft into orbit shortly before Alan Shepard's flight in 1961. But NASA scientists didn't give up. They announced that the next Mercury mission would orbit the Earth and that John Glenn would be on board.
Power, go. RF systems, go. Propulsion, go. Mercury capsule, go. All pre-start panel lights are correct. The ready light is on. Eject Mercury umbilical. Godspeed, John Glenn. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. Loud and clear. Roger, we're programming and roll okay.
On February 20th, 1962, millions of Americans watched their TV sets as John Glenn's Mercury spacecraft, dubbed Friendship 7, blasted into orbit. Everything went smoothly until Mission Control detected a problem halfway through the flight. A heat shield necessary to protect the spacecraft during re-entry into the atmosphere had come loose. If it failed, Glenn was in serious trouble.
There was a concern that if the heat shield was loose, when it got into the atmosphere, it would just fall away, in which case Mr. Glenn would be unprotected from the heat and could possibly burn up on re-entry.
Officials at Mission Control decided to cut the flight short after 3 orbits around the Earth. John Glenn, the veteran war hero, the seasoned test pilot, the highly trained astronaut, braced himself for the trip back home.
Of course, Glenn observed a real fiery re-entry because this rocket pack, as he re-entered, started burning up. And of course, it was molten metal coming around, and he could see out through the window. And so it was a pretty startling re-entry to him with the amount of fire and flames from the outside.
Coming down on 10, snorkels are open. Main chute is on green, chute is out in reach condition at 10,800 feet and beautiful chute.
But the re-entry was successful, with his Mercury capsule landing safely in the Atlantic Ocean. John Glenn had become the first American to orbit the Earth, reaching a height of 162.2 miles, traveling 75,679 miles during 3 trips around the globe. The entire flight lasted 4 hours, 55 minutes, and 23 seconds. Americans rejoiced at the news of Glenn's successful mission.
The American reaction to it was unexpected. It was just total exhilaration. The country, I think it was like a reinstatement into the position of leadership again, because now we had equaled the Russians with putting a man in space.
The Soviet response to this was, well, congratulations, Mr. President. In this case, it would have been John Kennedy as the president, and congratulations, NASA and John Glenn, on finally being able to put an American in orbit. Pretty much, it was a backhanded compliment.
John Glenn returned to a hero's welcome, accepting NASA's Distinguished Service Medal from President Kennedy and taking the opportunity to address a joint session of Congress.
As our knowledge of this universe in which we live increases, may God grant us the wisdom and guidance to use it wisely. Thank you.
Ironically, his February 20th mission was the last time John Glenn flew as part of the Mercury space program. President Kennedy felt it was too risky to send a national hero into space again.
At that time, we hadn't lost anybody in the space program, and they certainly didn't want to take a chance of John Glenn being the first guy to be lost, even though he was the first. So it was more or less the political pressure from the president, President Kennedy, that said John Glenn won't fly again.
Glenn had been grounded without a chance to plead his case. Knowing that he had no future as an astronaut, he left the space program in 1964 and retired from the Marine Corps as a lieutenant colonel the following year. Then President Lyndon Johnson elevated Glenn's retirement rank to colonel as a symbol of gratitude for his service to the country. Now out of the space program, Glenn turned his attention to politics. It would take 10 years, however, to finally win a political race, before which he held a number of executive-level posts in the private sector. Finally, in 1974, he won a U.S. Senate seat from Ohio, serving until 1997 as Ohio's only 4-term senator. An unsuccessful bid for president in 1984 left him deeply in debt, but not in spirit. John Glenn retired from politics in 1997. He made a name for himself in the Senate as a proponent of pro-space legislation. And because of a lifelong interest in medicine, his work as the chairman of the Special Committee on Aging kept him aware of advances in healthcare. Ironically, his knowledge in the healthcare realm would be his ticket back to space.
He began to feel that the space program had not experimented with the problem of aging, and that he thought that some progress could be made. And I think some of the doctors at the National Institute for Aging out here that he was working with as a part of his committee's work began to agree with him.
Glenn lobbied NASA to participate in aging research on a shuttle mission. He gave his reasons, his experience as a former astronaut, his still excellent health, and the fact that NASA had medical data on him dating back to the 1950s. It took NASA Administrator Dan Golden a year and a half to mull things over before finally approving the mission.
2, 1, liftoff.
John Glenn began the many months of training it took to get ready for another trip into space. At 77, he would set yet another record as the oldest person in space, eclipsing Story Musgrave, who served his last mission at age 61.
And we have SRB separation.
It does say something about how spaceflight has changed pretty significantly in the 30-plus years since John Glenn flew between 1962 and 1998. Spaceflight has become somewhat routine in the interim, in that 30-plus years. It was an enormously risky and difficult process with Project Mercury. It has become pretty much routine and accepted with the Space Shuttle.
October 29th, 1998 was a busy day at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Space Shuttle Discovery was scheduled to launch later that afternoon, and NASA technicians and crew members alike were busily preparing for takeoff. Months of training, physical regimens, and other preparations were now over. The real test would begin later in the afternoon.
We have a go for engine start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
As the Discovery lifted off into the October sky, the shuttle astronauts waited in anticipation to begin their mission objectives and for the glorious view of Earth from space. For John Glenn, the ride also marked a personal milestone.
I just want the record to show that we just passed 4 hours, 55 minutes, and 23 seconds. And I promised I'd take Senator Glenn on his second flight and make it a little bit longer than his first flight, and we've already accomplished that. So we're a bunch of smiling faces up here.
During the 9-day mission, shuttle astronauts took part in 83 scientific experiments, from launching a Spartan satellite to record data about the sun, to conducting medical research aimed at finding treatments for the aged. Despite the busy schedule, the retired senator from Ohio found time to remind Americans of their civic duty.
I'm proud to say that all of us on this flight voted by absentee ballot before we left. And so I just hope everybody does get out and vote. If you don't get out and vote, you give up your franchise to somebody else, and that's not the American way of doing things.
John Glenn's return to space was heralded a success by NASA and the scientific community. He proved that determination and ability could supersede age. But most important, his historic flight is an example to all Americans that you can never be too old to achieve something new.
We've gone from back in those days where we were just trying to find out if we can do it, out to now where these flights are literally out on the cutting edge of science, doing things that benefit directly or have the potential of being of enormous benefit to everybody right here on Earth. And that's what the space program's all about.
Okay. He may never again fly in orbit, yet this war veteran, public servant, and space hero has given Americans a reason to follow their dreams. A role model for young and old. His name is John Herschel Glenn, Jr., and he is a legend of air power.